Today on Utah Matters, use of lethal force. Have police gotten out of hand, or are they simply doing their job? A discussion next. Good morning and welcome to Utah Matters. Today, like every other day, law enforcement officers throughout the country and in Utah will get the call. They will be asked and required to inject themselves into a wide variety of circumstances, ranging from unlocking a car door to investigating a murder. They may engage in situations that may not end well for a perpetrator, a potential victim, or for the officers themselves. We are reminded of this almost daily with what seems like obsessive coverage of police actions like those in Missouri, New York, Cleveland, and Wisconsin. In Utah, the headline revolves around what appears to be a sudden increase in police-involved shootings and fatalities. Last year, 14 people were shot and killed by law enforcement officers in Utah. That's more than doubled from the year before. The circumstances surrounding some of the shootings have been controversial and have sparked protest and unrest with some residents. The anxiety is evident in places like a series of town hall meetings staged by Salt Lake City. It was designed to give citizens a chance to ask questions of law enforcement about policing policy.
Well, I cannot justify the behavior of these individual incidents, but I can answer the question. Officers are taught to shoot at body mass. Okay. Let me calm things down a minute so we can get to this lady's question. Has been you've had your hand up. Yes, ma'am.
If he did, he would have used it in the 7-Eleven, or he would have waved it, or he would have done something with the gun.
And the dispatcher did not relay all the information from the call. Yeah. You can clearly hear someone in the background saying, oh, they didn't have a gun. The caller's like, these youth had a gun. The other person on the line said, no, there was no gun. You know what I mean? But the dispatcher's only, just like in the Tamir Rice case, the caller says twice, it looks like a toy gun. We got a black male with a gun. You know what I mean? Yeah. You guys got to get your stuff straight. Your community is not down with me. That's right. We're not down.
Okay, calm down now. Let's kind of get productive questions. This lady's had her hand up.
So what's going on? Is it all of this a result of inadequate police training or a more aggressive attitude by suspects? Is it the changing demographic or a change in police philosophy? And how is the focus of all of this affecting the mood on the street from both the police perspective and from the perspective of those they are sworn to protect? We're discussing that today on Utah Matters with Ian Adams. Ian Adams is the spokesperson for the Fraternal Order of Police.
That's right.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Stephen Burton is a member of the Utah Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Excuse me. And Chris Manor is the director of Utah Against Police Brutality. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to make sure that people know where everyone's coming from and their interest in this. Ian, talk about what the Fraternal Order of Police is and what it does in situations like the ones that we have.
The Utah Fraternal Order of Police is the largest organization of currently serving police officers in Utah, law enforcement officers. I myself am a local police officer, still working. Our mission is to provide fraternal benefits and legal defense for officers. We represent those officers in legal, media, and political realms. So we are currently at 2,500 members, right about. So we are the largest police organization in Utah. Our national organization is the largest national organization. So
fraternity, not a union.
That's right. In Utah, we're not a union. Utah doesn't have collective bargaining or anything like that for police officers. So our underlying legal mission would be to make sure that police officers are afforded the same basic rights that any citizen in this country is afforded when they're accused of misconduct.
An officer is involved in an officer-involved shooting. One of his resources is the fraternity.
That's right. When an officer is involved in a shooting, he suddenly becomes the focus of a pretty intense criminal investigation. As such, he, as long as he's one of our members, he or she would be provided a lawyer to help guide them through that process.
Steve Burton, as a member of the Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, you keep an eye on these situations where police are involved and residents may have some problems with it, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself in an interesting position because for most of the time I'm in court defending somebody who's accused of a crime, and typically the primary witnesses against this person are law enforcement officers. So there's a great interest for me as a criminal defense attorney to make sure that they're telling the truth, that what they're saying as evidence against my clients is trustworthy and believable. But at the same time, as Ian mentioned, if an officer is involved in a shooting and there's an investigation into that shooting and the officer is the subject of a shooting, then that person becomes a client of a criminal defense lawyer. And so we do see both sides of the issue, and me personally, I am a former prosecutor, so I've worked on both sides of the courtroom and have seen it from a prosecutor standpoint and a defense attorney standpoint.
Very good. Chris, Utah Against Police Brutality. When did this organization begin and why?
This organization began in Utah roughly around the time in August when Michael Brown was shot, and then about 2 to 3 days later Dylan Taylor was shot at a 7-Eleven in Utah. We essentially began to protest what we saw was unjust shootings of both a unarmed black African-American person in Missouri as well as an unarmed person at 7-Eleven, hanging out with his brother and his cousin.
I want to start by making sure that everyone knows, hopefully we can educate on this program a little bit. What is justifiable force? What are the standards by which a police officer can use lethal force?
Ian, go ahead.
The initial, well, let's back it up. The Supreme Court, in a court case called Graham versus Connor, set out the standards, a test, if you will, for when any force is used, and that includes lethal force. So the Supreme Court said courts and legislatures, prosecutors, officers need to look at the type of crime that was being committed, what threat, if any, that the suspect poses to the community or an officer or themselves, and whether that suspect is fleeing or resisting. That's the basic three-pronged test. And then they added some very important language. The Supreme Court talks that they recognize police officers operate in a chaotic, fluid environment with ever-changing circumstances, and that we can't use 20/20 vision to go back and analyze split second by split second what the police officer should have done or could have done, but what that police officer knew at the time and were his or her actions reasonable. So you'll see that language adopted through all 50 states because this is a U.S. Supreme Court case. And that's the standard that officers are trained from the moment they enter the academy.
Is there a difference between the police department policy and the statute?
No. In fact, a police department policy as it relates to force can only be more strict. It couldn't be less strict than the standards set by Graham v. Connor.
Steve, is that how you understand it?
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, I mean, we see both sides of the coin. Actually, in our organization, we had a long discussion about our stance on this and whether or not we should be supportive of stricter guidelines for how these things are investigated, or whether or not we should be more supportive of defending people who are accused of using excessive force. So, there are really important issues and really important rights on both sides. If a police officer decides to use lethal force, at that point he is deciding, or by his actions, the consequence is that somebody loses their right to freedom and their right to life. And so us as defense attorneys, that's very important for us to protect somebody's freedom and somebody's right to life. But on the other side of the coin, we have to recognize that when somebody's accused of taking away someone's right to life unlawfully, that it is our job as defense attorneys to defend that person according to their rights to be presumed innocent. So on both sides of the coin, you have the presumption of innocence, that somebody should be presumed innocent, and lethal force should not be used when it's not necessary. But on the other side of things, if an officer is accused of using lethal force unlawfully, they should be presumed innocent, and we should protect their rights until all of the evidence comes forth.
Yeah. What's your best guess on why this sudden increase of police-involved shootings and fatalities? And secondly, your response to the fact that the investigations have all been ruled as justified.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that police brutality isn't a necessarily new issue. However, given the demonstrations that happened in Ferguson, it was on nightly news every night. And so that gets people to question and look at things in a different light, things we often miss just on the news in general. So yeah, people pay attention more now to police-involved shootings and use of force issues, which I think is ultimately a good thing for everybody involved. The one thing to keep in mind is that when we look at the media, it's always the case of, well, is this just happening at a more frequent case, as you might be asserting? You could look at their local news regarding house fires. Are we having more house fires now, or are we just reporting on them more? And that's always the difficult question to analyze when you're looking at the media. Because obviously there's various decisions that go into what gets put on the front page, what gets run, what gets interviewed, what gets investigated and followed up on. So it's really hard to look at the media and kind of assess what's going on in reality.
Okay. But there has been a slight increase in those incidents up until 2014, and then there was a real bump. Any ideas? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, in the previous 5 years, so 2009 through 2014, you saw an average of 9 per year. What that equates out to, you know, Utah sees about 150,000 arrests per year. What that equates out to is if you're even being arrested, so we're not talking the population at large, but if you're being arrested, the odds that you'll be involved in any kind of police shooting are right around 0.07 So it is an extraordinary event and deserves extraordinary scrutiny. Whether 14 in 1 year is a large enough sample size to statistically prove that there's a huge jump, or, you know, we don't know. I think that's a longer term decision, and I think Chris is absolutely right that there's some analyzing that'll take place in the long run to determine that. I could tell you from a police officer, line officer standpoint, things do seem more violent on the street. I mean, just in general. Utah's population continues to grow. I think that's important to remember. We're not 1970 Utah anymore. We're not 1980 Utah anymore. This is 2015 now.
Besides the growth, Ian, do you attribute that to anything else?
I think that some of the media coverage nationwide has blown some of this out of proportion in some people's minds. I think that some suspects now want almost a martyrdom. They want to be on YouTube, they want to be on the local news, and so when you have some people who are mentally unstable and you add that extra dose of media coverage, it can drive people to do stuff they wouldn't normally do.
Stephen, what's your view?
Well, I think a couple of the controversial issues regarding this situation is that there was a Tribune article that came out that said that deaths from police shootings was the second highest cause of death in the past 5 years. So intimate partners was #1, and then police shootings. And that it exceeded gang violence and drug dealer violence and child abuse. And although that may skew the way we look at things, it is important to note that it was the second leading cause of death by shooting was by police. The other thing that I think is controversial is whether or not a shooting is legally justified. I think that an important question is whether or not it's necessary. So we look at some of the specific incidents that have happened in Utah in the past couple of years, and we see body camera footage, and we're able to analyze those situations. And in some of those situations, we can see where perhaps the officer may have been able to avoid using lethal force. And because they didn't use certain techniques, or because of the choices that they made, it put them in a situation that, although legally justified, may have been unnecessary, and somebody lost their life because of that.
I just want to also add really quick, we can analyze statistics all we want, but that's a very one-sided way of looking at things. You also have to talk to the people. You have to talk to people like Gina Thane, you have to talk to people like Susan Hunt, who actually have lost somebody, who don't get answers, who actually become investigated themselves. who's deceased now are looked at as criminals and are always referred to as criminals in police reports. So when it comes down to it, yes, there's a loss of life. The shooting was justified, but at the same time, the people who are impacted don't realize a sense of justice involved. All they have is an empty place at the dinner table now.
When we come back after this break, we want to take one or two of these incidents and break them down, because we do, as you mentioned, we have police cameras now, a lot of body cams, and address the issue of how things may have been or may not have been addressed differently by the officer. We're talking about excessive use or lethal force used by police. We'll be back in a moment on Utah Matters. Welcome back to Utah Matters. We're talking about lethal force, in particularly used by police. We have with us Ian Adams. He's the spokesman for the Fraternal Order of Police in Utah. Steve Burton is a criminal defense lawyer, and Chris Manor is the director of Utah Against Police Brutality. We want to take a very specific incident. This was with incident that was quite evident in the news just recently, this year actually. The incident of a man up in the avenues who was shoveling snow, or claimed he was shoveling snow, and a police officer was called out by some of the residents to check him out. Let's take a look at, this is from the police camera, the body camera that was on the policeman himself. That will be obvious to you, but let's take a look at it and then we'll talk about it right there.
I've had a couple people call about you, saying we don't have any snow to be removed because there's no snow in the driveway, no snow on the edge. Wonder what you're doing in the area.
There is snow on the edge. Like over here, there's some snow, like on the sidewalk edges and things like that. So.
What's your name?
No, I don't. I'm not giving you my name.
Why not?
Because I'm just doing my business.
You got a business license?
Sure I do.
What's it under?
I know. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm just doing.
Okay. Well, I've had neighbors call saying they saw you looking in cars yesterday. They said you come up today, and they said they don't have snow removal. They don't need no snow removal. Knocking on houses.
This guy over here. I talked to him over here.
I don't know who it was called. It was an anonymous. They gave your description though.
I talked to him already. I talked to him. He has some snow over there, and I'm mainly looking for in the future when it snows again.
That's not what he said you told him.
Some people don't like to.
He said you told him you're out looking for snow removal, and he has no snow to be removed.
Well, there's a little bit on the sides. So yeah.
No, it's warm. It's all that.
All right. Well, I'll wait for it to snow again, and then and then I'll be back there.
So what's your name?
I'm not going to give you my name.
Why aren't you giving me your name? You know you're required by law to give me your name when I'm doing an investigation, or you can be arrested for failure to give your information.
I'm doing my business.
No, you're suspicious in the neighbor. People are calling in on you. I just didn't stop you for no reason. Let me explain something to you.
No, I'm doing my business,
Let me explain something. You need to
I'm
calm
trying to
down.
make a living!
Okay, you need to calm down and quit yelling at me right now.
Go back to your car.
No,
I'm
you
doing
need to
my
calm down.
business!
Bravo 146, send me another unit. You need to calm down right now.
No, you need to calm down. I'm
No,
doing my
sir.
business.
I'm trying to find out what you're doing.
If I'm stealing, then
Didn't say
you
were
can get
stealing
in my
anything.
face.
You need to
You
stop
can't get
right
in
now.
my face, man. You fucking...
Okay, this is a tragic case of James Barker, who ended up being shot and killed in this situation. Ian, from the police standpoint, I know it's easy to second guess, but what could have been done differently here to avoid this?
Well, it's important to remember that the officer, or any officer, is reacting to behavior. So the officer is called by concerned neighbors. He shows up. He has the right to identify that person in this particular case. Once he begins to ask for that identification, things go downhill pretty quickly. And what wasn't added in the preface there was the officer who was attacked violently suffered a broken arm and broken bones in his foot as well. And the last frame of that video is that snow shovel coming down on the officer's chest. That's what the body camera catches just before it's shattered by the force of the blow.
You're right, it doesn't show that. So his broken leg and his wrist was from the shovel itself, or from the fall?
I think it was a foot and a broken arm and foot.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then that final blow being captured by the video tells the story. That officer was clearly in danger of serious bodily injury or death, which, as we talked about earlier, is one of the standards. As an officer, I could tell you, in that situation, there were two people. one who knew what was about to happen and one who didn't. The officer's the one that didn't know what was about to happen, and thank God that officer was there to confront Mr. Barker. Thank God it wasn't somebody's child inside that house. That wasn't his house he was at. Thank God it wasn't a 15-year-old daughter coming out outside to confront Mr. Barker, because she wouldn't have had the means to defend herself. Officers are thrown into chaotic, fluid environments. The officer's just showing up on a typical suspicious person type call. He was not, I promise, he was not expecting to show up into a lethal force encounter.
Steve, you're sitting down with this officer, and your job is to try to avoid what happened there, but also allow the officer to do his job. What are you telling him?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a perfect example of the competition between one person's rights and another person's rights. I mean, I think that everybody would agree that at the point where he's being struck with the snow shovel, where his arm's broken, at that point he was justified to use lethal force. I mean, he could have easily been killed if he was struck on the head. He wasn't. But although that was deemed legally justified to use lethal force, I mean, the important question for us, defending people who are often accused of crimes, is to preserve their presumption of innocence. So we don't know if he was out looking to commit a crime, or if in truth he was out looking to shovel snow and earn a couple bucks. The question was, well, do you have a business license? And really, I mean, whether or not he had a business license, whether or not he was conducting business legally, I mean, that type of thing would not justify a death penalty. And so you see these competing interests, and in this specific situation, when I saw the video, based upon my limited experience dealing with people with mental health issues or clients with mental health issues.
Which we determined this gentleman may have had some.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
I can speak to that. Yes, he actually did. He suffered a surfing injury, and as a result of that, had problems processing information and responding in real time, and was quick to anger, that kind of thing. But at the same time, people like Summer Osborne and Heidi Kleibaugh, who I've met, who were both, one was his partner, one was a longtime college friend, they stated that this gentleman lived in the neighborhood, was very peace-loving, was very concerned with environmental issues, but at the same time, one interaction with an officer where the officer felt the need to impose authority on the situation. And the thing I want to keep in mind, while Ian is right, you can never look back and say, well, what could have been different from the officer's perspective? We do have a good 2-minute conversation with the officer that we should put into practice in the future, where you don't continually escalate the situation, where you realize he becomes agitated every single time he gets asked for his name, and that when the officer calls for backup, he probably shouldn't try to escalate to a physical confrontation, even though that's what the training states they should do, but at the same time, he had backup on the way. I think it could have been resolved much differently, but at the same time, we have to think about the future. What lessons are officer and law enforcement and training going to take away from these kinds of instances of dealing with mentally unstable people? It's looking out for triggers and how to resolve them more peacefully.
Well, and I think as a training issue, I mean, a lot of that information we did learn after the fact, or that officer learned after the fact, but even me, not having dealt with that specific person before, I could immediately recognize a couple of indicators which I thought showed that this person may have a mental illness. And in police officer training, when somebody goes through post, they receive certain segments of training. I think it's 12 hours for conflict resolution, 8 hours for dealing with people who have mental health issues. And if you think about the type of training that you've received in your life through school or something else, I mean, 8 hours of training in order to deal with every possible situation doesn't seem to be enough. I mean, it seems like in order to give an officer the right to take someone's life or take someone's freedom and only give them 8 hours of training on how to deal with people who have mental health issues doesn't seem like that's enough. It seems like this officer could have recognized that this person may have a mental health issue and waited for backup to arrive, or waited for support so that that issue could have been resolved in another way.
Well, hold on. Let's not underestimate the level of experience officers have with dealing with people with mental illness. This was not a case where the officer initiated or escalated physical confrontation. He may well have recognized that that officer might have, or that suspect might have some mental illness. That is a very common occurrence for all police officers. That doesn't mean that you're about to be engaged in a lethal encounter, that your life is about to be taken or you're about to be seriously injured. The officer has a duty to the community to stay there. He doesn't have a duty to retreat when confronted with somebody who's becoming verbally escalated. That officer has a duty to stay there. The officer did what he was supposed to. He called for a backing officer. I think that frankly caused Mr. Barker to escalate even further, realizing that he had warrants. He may well face custody over those warrants, and that's what provided that final trigger. When we're dealing with mental health, you're absolutely right. 8 hours wouldn't be enough. 8 hours wouldn't be enough for a PhD psychologist. It's going to take 9 months for them to get a good diagnosis and treatment plan, and yet we expect an officer in quarter-second increments to somehow make everything okay. The officer is the last person to deal with someone who has been formed by society for 30 years. They're the last person. They're not going to be able to fix everything that happened before with that.
I want to go through, hit the checklist one more time. And talking about technology, go ahead, Chris.
Well, really quick with the issue of officers being trained to shoot. Obviously, they have to deal with a threat, but then the question is, what constitutes a threat to the officer's life? Did Dylan Taylor actually pose a threat to Officer Braun Cruz? And the answer is, according to the DA, according to all the legal jurisdiction and all that stuff, yes, he did. However, the first thing that's said after Dylan Taylor is shot and is bleeding out is, whoa, buddy, where's the gun? So now, yes, officers have to deal with threats, and I'm not denying that, but the question is, when they aren't dealing with a threat and they actually do use lethal force, that's the sort of issue that affects community members and impacts families, and that's the raw sort of issue.
This is Utah Matters. We're talking about lethal force by the police force. We'll be right back. Well, we've determined that we've got far too much to discuss to end it here. We're going to keep the tape rolling, say goodbye, and we'll continue this discussion next week on Utah Matters. Thank you for joining us this week. See you next week.